ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our next practice's weekly call. This week we are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're so grateful that you're all here. And today we're going to be talking about how you can reevaluate your DE&I strategy with Pitney Bowes. So very excited to share this quote of the day. Sheryl's going to talk a little bit more about the song and the quote, but our quote for today is, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." So I think that's going to set a beautiful tone for the conversation that we're going to have today. Of course, this call is always driven around discovering the people practices that drive high performance. We work very hard at I4CP to help support you in seeing what's coming around the corner. So everything that we do at I4CP is deeply rooted in high performance organizations. And I just want to take some time to explain how we define that. Our research analysts conduct all of our studies looking at organizations that excel in 4 main areas. Those are revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And we're not only looking at what high performance organizations do differently than low performance organizations, because 99% of the time there's always a big difference, but through regression analysis, we're looking for those specific practices that are providing that bottom line business impact. And we're looking at how that's happening over a 5-year time horizon. So just want to make sure that you are all grounded in how we're defining high performance here at I4CP for our members and non-members alike. Speaking of our members, we're really excited just to highlight some of our incredible new members. This is only a partial list of our members, but you can all see there is such a spectrum of industries and organizational sizes. So incredible high performance organizations represented here. And we do have a really important survey coming up. We are looking at how organizations are supporting their employees' continuing education and upskilling efforts. For this survey, and Zeta, thanks for just dropping a link to that in the chat here. We're partnering with Upskill America. It's an initiative of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute, and we're working to understand how organizations design and support employee upskilling. We'll explore tuition assistance practices, apprenticeships, work and learn programs, and organizations' internal education efforts. So if you complete this link and then take it by November 14th, which is when we'll be closing the survey, you'll receive early access to the results. So definitely take that survey. And I see that we are already sharing some additional resources here in the chat. This week, Jackie Robertson and I are joining you as your call facilitators. Jackie is the Chief Diversity Officer at the Cleveland Clinic, and she also is the chair for our CDO board. We have our upcoming calls scheduled almost through the end of the year right now, but the next calls that we have coming up next week will be focused on talent and learning, and we'll be bringing in Catherine Varatarava, the Vice President and Chief Talent Officer at Levi Strauss. And then following that, we'll be meeting with the Chief Talent Officer from Thriveit for our talent and learning call. And then at the beginning of December, we'll have our research team joining us, Tom Stone and John Sutton, who's our VP of Business Development, to talk about what the year ahead looks like. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce you all to Jackie Robertson. Keep your questions coming in the chat. We're going to have a very active discussion, and I'll be continuing to filter those questions to share with Jackie today.
Wonderful. Nina, thank you so much. I am so excited about this upcoming conversation, and particularly this one, because I feel like I'm going to be talking to one of my oldest and dearest friends, as well as colleagues, Sheryl Battles of Pitney Bowes. So I'm really excited about it. And Sheryl is the Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion and Engagement at Pitney Bowes. I've always admired Cheryl's leadership strategy, methodology, and practices always just seem to be way ahead of the pack. And I know Cheryl, in all of her humility, will push back on that. But I've always admired your insight, Cheryl. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, particularly because we were talking about all of the implications of the SCOTUS decision. And you impressed me so much when you talked about um, we are deeply rooted in our strategy at Pitney Bowes. And we are remaining firm in staying the course on our strategy. And so I was so intrigued by that and how you're going about it. That's going to be our conversation today. But before we get into that, I just want to say welcome. It is so good to see you as always, even if it's virtually. I'll take whatever I can get. And I just want to start by saying I was really jamming to that song earlier. And I want this audience, for those of the folks in the audience who don't know you, to have an opportunity to get to know you. So you know the usual, tell us about the song you chose, why that's your song, any particular quote, and then we're going to get into the conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jackie, for that gracious introduction. We have a mutual admiration society. I am very excited about this conversation as well. The name of the song is Together, and it's by King and Country featuring Kirk Franklin and Tori Kelly. And what's interesting to me about the song, it kind of resonates on a couple of levels. It was recorded in their respective homes in 2020 during the pandemic. And the lyrics and the concept behind the song really struck such a chord. The music videos had over 19 million views. And it really kind of captured that global moment of disruption and uncertainty. And there's even a lyric that says, life is now upside down, right? And so, but it goes on to encourage everyone that you might think you're alone, but you're not. And we are going to get through this together. And goes on to talk about, we're going to make it through hand in hand. And if we fall, we'll fall together. But oh, when we rise, we will rise together.
Mm.
So that concept of living in unsettled times, but we're not alone, is really in many respects how I think about this work, that the solution can be found in being together and creating the space and the ability to do that. And it's kind of why I do what I do, and I think it's why we're having this conversation. There's that African proverb that we love about, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together.
Love it. I love it. Oh, you just gave me goosebumps. And it's so true. There has been so much disruption and uncertainty, and I'm really looking forward to getting into that part of the conversation. But I'd be remiss if I didn't just give you a moment to share with this audience a little bit about yourself, your background, the work at Pitney Bowes, and then certainly I know most of us are familiar with Pitney Bowes' iconic brand and products, but if you could just share a little bit more about your global operations and your business so that all of us in the audience are on the same page.
I will be brief about me. I was born in a small town in Texas, and went to college in California, graduating from Stanford University with a degree in human biology. I have spent most of my career in communication, so I think of myself as a storyteller. And I often jokingly say, maybe not so much jokingly, my first communications job was talking to my parents about not using my degree in biology to go into a medical profession, but really wanting to kind of explore the world of communications. I've worked in a variety of industries, a variety of size organizations. And at Pitney Bowes, I've been there a long time. I've been a speechwriter for 3 CEOs. I've done investor and financial communications, media relations, thought leadership, crisis communications, basically you name it. From a communications perspective, I've done it. Because of Pitney Bowes' history in diversity and inclusion, however, being a corporate communicator, particularly doing the executive comms for the CEOs, it meant that I was communicating about diversity quite a bit. So I've been in the space thinking about diversity for a very, very long time, but really didn't get into the strategy side of the profession until 2015. And then in 2018, I got not only the strategy, but the operations for diversity and employee engagement from a global perspective, along with the communications for all 3 of those areas. So that's kind of my story. Pitney Bowes is, you probably know us, or you may have heard our name and not be quite sure what we do, but we're a global shipping and mailing company that provides technology, logistics, and financial services to help clients reduce the complexities of sending parcels and mail. I like to call ourselves kind of a big, small company with 3.5 billion in revenue last year, over 11,000 employees globally. We have about 600,000 clients worldwide, but 95% of our services are cloud-based. So we service 90% of the Fortune 500 in terms of shipping, receiving, mailing, and tracking. We have a global e-commerce business that does design, fulfillment, delivery, returns, and cross-border services. So there are 1 million+ marketplace sellers who use our e-commerce solutions. We manage over 500 million parcels per year, and our pre-sort organization processes more than 16 billion, and that is with a B, pieces of mail annually. We are the largest workshare partner of the USPS and the second largest handler of mail in the world.
Incredible. That's incredible. Thank you for that, Sheryl. And I think even for those of us who are familiar with Pitney Bowes, some of the numbers that you just quoted are just astounding. We had someone in the chat, I just saw it pop up, that they are a small customer of yours. So you've got some customers and some clients on the phone as well.
Yay.
So let's start by level setting with a timeline, some of the ebbs and flows that diversity, equity, and inclusion has gone through just over the years. And so I'm going to ask Nina or Zeta to put that timeline up. And so Sheryl, you and I have looked at this, and back in the 60s and 70s, diversity and inclusion, it's probably just diversity at that point, was really all about compliance-driven diversity, EEO. You had the Civil Rights Title, 6 Act going on then, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act. I mean, clearly a lot of challenges that needed to be addressed were addressed, but it was really addressed via law. First ERGs were formed at Xerox, Employee Resource Groups. Then we kind of shifted into the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, when we moved from compliance-driven to more of a talent-driven. Talent was really the imperative. So it was beyond race and gender, and organizations were realizing that if they were not talent driven, any of their initiatives around diversity were not going to be sustainable. Compliance alone is not a sustainable strategy. And so you had things going on there. You had the Family and Medical Leave Act. You had Americans with Disabilities Act, the rise of the Chief Diversity Officer role. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, right? So all of that was going on in this talent-driven era. And then we moved into 2010s, 2020s. It was more strategy driven. And you saw a focus on, not just diversity, but diversity and equity, and inclusion. Many organizations have added the B for belonging. Truly a business imperative. We really got to the point where we felt like we didn't have to share the business case each and every time we engaged in a conversation with leaders, that the business case was kind of clear. Can't necessarily say that post SCOTUS decision. But the Me Too movement was going on there. I think, let's talk about some of the disruptives. So, George Floyd was murdered during this time. The pandemic hit. That was truly a disruption. Most recently, the war in Israel. And these disruptors, I go back to what you said earlier, there's just been such disruption and uncertainty throughout all of this. So I think it's so important, and you and I agree on this, we've talked about this, and I want to talk about how we got here and the importance of what's next, but I think it's so important to understand the past when creating this future-focused DE&I strategy. And so first of all, feel free to make any comments on this. Is there anything I missed? Because at this point, I really want to kind of go into, how do you stay the course with your strategy? But feel free to just make some comments or share your thoughts on this event timeline, Sheryl, before we go farther.
Well, certainly. And as you know, I was so excited when we were talking about having this conversation, the meeting before the meeting. And we came up with the idea of this timeline because I think it just lays out, it just makes it so plain and underscores that this really has been quite a journey, and that it's a journey, if you will, of what's going on with people. And that sounds really simplistic, but it really is pretty profound, in that ultimately, when we are talking about diversity and inclusion, we're talking about the journey of humankind. And that's what we see when we take a look at this timeline in terms of what was going on and the way it has hopefully shifted from more from compliance to talent to business essential.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love the way you said that. And I saw a comment come up in the chat, and I want to address it. When I mentioned the war in Israel, absolutely the war in Israel, the war in Gaza. And so I apologize for that. I know that is very sensitive right now. And I don't mean to disrupt the conversation with Sheryl and myself, but I thought that was important enough to make that edit and make that correction. So thank you, Beth, for bringing that up in the chat. And so, Sheryl, one of the things that I've admired about you, it doesn't matter what the disruptions have been. Pitney Bowes has a way of staying the course, which tells me that your foundations that are rooted in your DE&I strategy are deep. It's strategy, it's culture, it's all of that. I'd love for you to talk to this audience about how do we make a strategy that goes beyond the moment, that's resilient and sustainable, especially as it relates to the external scrutiny and the attacks of dysfunction. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. I think a lot of it, Jackie, and a lot of it is as much about kind of an understanding of where we've come from, where we are, and then aligning with uh, who we are and where we want to be. So that alignment of the diversity and inclusion strategy with, as you mentioned earlier, the culture of the organization, the business strategy of the organization, and the values of the organization is critical, because that's where the sustainability lies. If it's not true to who the organization is, it will, over time, and oftentimes sooner rather than later, fall away, because it's viewed as incremental. It's an add-on. It's something that we have to think about doing extra. When it's fundamental, foundational to who you are and how you act and how you want to treat one another, then it embeds itself through all of the necessary layers. And that's what makes it sustainable and replicable. We spend a lot of time thinking about the past, because as Churchill was quoted as saying, he didn't originate the quote, but those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So we think there's value in that history, because it illustrates, much like this timeline, that it's a journey and not a destination. It demonstrates how the journey is very specific to what's going on both internally and externally. And then it provides the context for your current strategy and priorities, the why. Because if you don't understand your why, it's very difficult then over time to sustain who and the what. So you can make a short-term impact without a lot of thought. But in terms of a sustainable impact, you've got to really be very clear about why you're doing what you're doing. Who is it that you are reaching and impacting? And then what are the priorities and the real approach for not just getting there, but for staying there?
You mentioned a couple of things. I think by aligning your strategy with your organization's values, you certainly create a certain stickiness, or what I like to call a very high switching cost. It's kind of difficult to switch away from a strategy that has been so deeply rooted and embedded in the values that that organization holds dear. But you said something earlier that tells me you have your finger on, or fingers in, the secret sauce of this work, because you said you have not gone through, I'm not using my words correctly, but you have seen 3 CEOs come and go during your tenure. And before I even get into a question around, metrics and how are you moving forward with your metrics in this new world that we're in? How do you keep your leaders rooted in the why? I think that's part of your secret sauce. There is something that you're doing there. You're not having to go back and repeat the business case, regardless of the disruption. You are somehow keeping your leaders not only strongly rooted in the why, but it sounds like they're very engaged, or just as engaged as you in that why. So can you talk to us about that? Can you share a little bit of your secret sauce?
Well, certainly, there's a saying about getting the leadership for the times. And I think that we've been very blessed for that to be the case at Pitney Bowes. We're over 100 years old, and our DE&I journey is over 80 years old. And it started with a CEO in 1942, who was appointed by President Roosevelt to be a part of something known as the War Production Board. And in essence, they were, it was a way of coordinating the manufacturing and production capabilities across the US in support of the Allied war efforts. And so the thought was that you would be able then to produce what was needed very rapidly at a very high quality if we had the ability to kind of look across the country and use all of the manufacturing capability there. The issue was talent, however, because at the time, about 30% of the US population age 16 and older, male, were already involved in the war effort. And so the War Production Board, and our CEO was kind of over a 6-state region, made the decision that they were going to, I like to say, open the aperture and look beyond where they had traditionally looked for talent for these manufacturing facilities and open it up. And so they opened up to women. We've all heard about Rosie the Riveter, but they also opened it up to the disabled and to African Americans. And what we saw and what came out of that for our CEO was he talked about the productivity, the work ethic, the quality of work, the trainability of this, quote, new workforce. And he wrote a memo to the head of personnel in about 1943 and said, I want to make sure that there are no processes or practices that preclude us from hiring talented people, irrespective of race or religion. And then went on to create something that we call the Merit Employment Program, and underscore nothing, no processes or practices. So he wanted to make sure there was nothing systemic, right? And then when he created the Merit Employment Program, he was looking to open up opportunity for talented people to get the job done. So historically, what has happened with each CEO that we've had has really, in their own way, echoed, we want to provide access and opportunity to the people we need to get the job done. And we don't want to do it necessarily as an add-on or a special single program. It's embedded in how we think about our human capital and in how we look to optimize, if you will, our investment in people.
It sounds so incredibly simple and practical and logical. But I know that that does not automatically happen and continue through additional CEOs. Everyone, most CEOs want to make their own stamp on something, but the fact that that philosophy has continued is impressive. Nina, do you need me to pause here? Are there any questions or comments in the chat? Would you like me to keep going?
I think definitely feel free to keep going. I think people are just very much leaning in, but no questions so far.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, talk about, Sheryl, if you would, the need for this audience for ongoing assessment of the purpose, the stakeholders, the objectives of the strategy, and talk a little bit about what are the metrics you're focused on now? I mean, given everything that's happened with the SCOTUS decision, what are the metrics that you're focused on to sustain your DE&I strategy? So, for example, I know, one of the things I'm understanding from the interpretation of the law around this is, we are not needing to shy away from the data and our metrics. That continues to be important. We will use it as an inflection point or a reflection. But talk to us a little bit talk to us a little bit about the stakeholders, the objectives of the strategy, but also what are the metrics that you're using today that you know will help you to sustain your DE&I strategy?
So, when you think about this ongoing assessment, it sounds almost trite, but the one thing we're sure of is change. And change is happening at
Yes.
a rate and a scale that in many ways is both technology aided, but it's also aided by our global interconnection, if you will. So there's a lot going on right now. And if you've got a strategy, again, if you're why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because we want to optimize people. Because we understand that ultimately, and we talk a lot about human-centered, right? But again, that started for us back in the 30s, that business is about people. People have differences. Those differences are assets. And when you combine everyone's individual assets, then you can yield greater results than any one individual can. So that's why that concept of together is really important to us. So how do you get at that? When you think about what does that mean from a stakeholder perspective? Well, it certainly means that D&I or even employee engagement are the exclusive realm of our D&I team or HR or those in, whose job it is to think about our people. The carrying the strategy forward and being involved in making ours the kind of environment where people can have their voice heard, learn and grow, have the opportunity to do meaningful work, and be involved in our success, take ownership of our success. Creating that kind of environment, it takes all layers of the organization. So yes, you've got to have that commitment from the top, and it's got to be role modeled. And yes, it's got to be embedded in your processes and practices so that your promises aren't running into the reality of how your business actually operates. So have we really looked at all the processes and practices? Then it's got to be part of the culture. Is this the kind of culture where it's okay to be who you are? In our recent engagement survey, where we had over 88% participation on a global basis, we got a 91% on my manager works effectively with people who are not like them. And I can be myself here without worry, because we measure, getting back to those metrics, we measure from an employee sentiment perspective. Does this feel like that kind of place to you, right? Because the stakeholders in making this the environment that it definitely is leadership, but it's also every single employee. It's also that collective body of policies and practices, and it's also individual behavior and attitude. So you've got to really impact all four of those things broadly to have something that is sustainable and impactful. So then how do you measure it? You measure it in the same way that you calibrate who those stakeholders are. So it's about life cycle data, looking at, are employees having an equitable experience throughout the life cycle? Look at your hires, look at your learning and development opportunities, look at who's on special projects and assignments, look at your succession pipeline, look at your promotions, look at your attrition. All of those things are things that happen in the life of each and every employee.
Mhm.
Are they happening at the same rate in the same way for every employee? So looking at that data, if you will point us to any what I call opportunity gaps and point us to, here's an area where you can focus and make an impact. Nothing is more harmful to your diversity and inclusion efforts than spending a lot of time doing things that people don't value or that
Mhm.
don't make an impact.
Mhm.
So we look at the employee life cycle because we know those are things that make an impact on employees. It
Mhm.
impacts their productivity, it impacts their engagement, it impacts the way they collaborate and interact with each other, it impacts whether they decide to stay, and it impacts whether or not they decide to recommend us as a great place to work. So we look at the life cycle, the data coming off of that, as metrics to give us some sense of what that experience is like. We also look to employees directly. So whether it's an engagement survey or frequent, shorter, more focused pulse surveys, focus groups, you name it, we are looking to get the employee voice. We are looking to hear from them. I was talking to my team about something we're working on, and it's a great idea. And it sounds great on paper, and we've pulled together a cross-functional team to stand up a pilot on it. But I keep pressing everybody that's involved. Do we know that this is something that people want? Have
Mhm.
we talked to anybody about how having something like this would make a difference in their life? Or what would be the benefit? Or why would this be beneficial? So if you don't hear from employees, if you don't know, creating solutions in a vacuum are not sustainable solutions, and you've invested a lot of time and effort that it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of nice, but maybe doesn't get utilized.
Mhm.
So that second piece of what you're measuring, what you're looking at, is that employee sentiment to really kind of understand what's going on. We also do a lot with benchmarking. How do we stack up against others, both in general, in our various industries? We look at it from a regional perspective. Um, don't get me wrong, diversity and inclusion is a very customized journey. That's also what makes it sustainable, because you're doing what you as an organization, what's authentic to you, what's important to you because it's aligned with your strategy, and what's going to be supportive of your people. It doesn't mean that there aren't practices that you could hear that another company is doing and think about it and incorporate it or adjust it to use it in your organization. Of course you can. But it does mean that you cannot create a strategy solely based on what other people are doing. So we look at the benchmarks to get a good sense of what others are doing, but then we filter that through, okay, so how does that align with where we're trying to go and
Mhm.
what we need?
Cheryl, that is so compelling. I mean, it was clear from everything you just said, focusing on the life cycle of the employee, making sure that all employees have an equitable experience. You know, that's kind of like the bread and butter, if you will, and not being so tempted or distracted by external benchmarks to pull in what could easily be the flavor of the month if you don't stay the course on those things that are fundamental to your organization. And I love what you said. I think to each organization, it's really a customized journey. But I love the stability of the metrics that you spoke about during that life cycle. I want to just take a pause here. And Nina, I'm going to hand it over to you because I see quite a few comments and questions coming through the text.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of questions from the
And,
audience right now.
and before we move further, let's pull down the slide so we can see each other if anyone wants to come on, come into view. Perfect.
Thank you, Jackie. So one question for you, Sheryl, is just a little bit more information on your employee listening strategy. So people would love to know more about what the timing of that looks like, the pulse surveys, the overall engagement strategy. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you time this?
Sure. And we are using, we are great experimenters. And because we want to try it, it's almost the fail fast. We want to try it, see if it works on a smaller scale, and then see how scalable is it or how applicable is it to any piece of our population. Our listening strategy is much like that. We do an annual engagement survey, but we also have a tool for that is currently has just been piloted with a different piece of our population where they are being surveyed every 3 weeks. Clearly, every 3 weeks, you're not asking the same kind of question or the depth of question that we are in the annual survey. They give us very different looks at what's going on, and we can look at very different issues. The more frequent pulse surveys are more targeted, they're shorter, and they're very narrow in terms of what they are looking at, and really trying to get some real-time feedback that managers can use immediately. Because irrespective of how you're listening to employees or how frequently you are listening to employees, if you don't do anything with what you hear, they're going to stop talking to you. So we maintain very high levels of participation in, for example, our annual survey, because there's then a process where we talk about it as being the beginning of the conversation with employees. It's not the end. We don't just ask you and we say, okay, create a plan, and the plan goes on the shelf. It's actually an ongoing conversation with the employees of, hey, we heard you on this. This is how we think this ties, because we try to tie the engagement and those measures with how we're meeting our objectives, how we are creating value for our stakeholders. So there's a need to really turn it into actionable things, but actionable things that involve the employees and their suggestions so that they know we heard them and they're involved in the solution.
Mm-hmm. So it really sounds like the employees are being heard, so it gets them to continue to participate in this. How is that data shared back? How are you making them feel heard? How is that data being shared to the managers, and how are you transferring that knowledge that you're getting from your listening strategy across the organization?
So certainly each manager has their own customized dashboard where they can see the aggregate scores. If they have at least 5 employees who participate in the survey, they can see the aggregate scores of their team. We also have, again, our C-suite holds a series of meetings with their respective organizations on here's our results. Here's what we heard from you. What do you think we should be working on together? And so, and while it varies across the business, some create special teams of people to think about, here's what we're going to do. But those teams, however they do it, they come back to the employees on an ongoing basis and say, okay, this is what we're going to work on. This is what we think we heard you say. We also do, a lot of leaders do listening tours after the survey. So here's the 5 things I think I heard. Would you agree that that's what you were thinking about or feeling as a team when you did the survey?
Mhm.
So it's a lot of almost call and response, where we try to be very, very transparent with, here's the results and here's what we're thinking about those. What do you think? And so that it becomes a conversation as opposed to just a report out and then nothing happens.
Yeah, so you continue just to stay focused on the why with every part of this process. I'm going to go back to a question that came up just a little bit earlier, because it sounds like Pitney Bowes is investing heavily in this with the people, with the time. And there was a question just around our DE&I budgets being cut across the board, and what are organizations doing with this, in the wake of, the past, like since George Floyd. And I was wondering, how is Pitney Bowes responding to that? Do you feel like your DE&I budget is affected by less emphasis?
No, we haven't had any reduction, but we're not big spenders. We're not big spenders. So we didn't have any great influx of more budget or more people after George Floyd. And so we haven't had any great fluctuation in that, what's the saying? The future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. Between George Floyd and the SCOTUS ruling, you were already seeing some organizations pulling back on their efforts. Slashing, they did a lot of staffing. So some organizations staffed up really heavily. And by last 18 months, they've been cutting those staffs pretty consistently. There's a stat, CDOs are 30% more likely to be laid off than other C-suite people. And again, there was a companion stat that I don't have at the top of my head about how many CDOs were hired right after George Floyd. So I think we saw some, if you do it in economic terms, some inflation relative to the focus and the attention and the resources paid to DE&I, and it wasn't sustainable for some because, again, there wasn't a clear why are we doing it and how does it align with who we say we are, who we want to be, and where we want to go.
Well, thank you so much, Sheryl, for making time for the audience questions. I hope that you get some time at some point to read all of these amazing comments. There's so much resonance with everything that you're saying. So you're really, really being heard on this call.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's one thing I see in the chat from Darby, and I just wanted to say, she noted, it's concerning to me to think of people as a means to an end, as assets. People have inherent value for being and deserve to be loved, supported, and included. That is 100% correct. 100% correct. By assets, certainly. What I mean is, when an organization hires an individual, they are investing in that individual. Just like you invest in technology, just like you invest in consulting services, just like you invest in things to make that business fulfill its mission and serve who it's supposed to serve. So when I say that people, we are talking about optimizing our investment in our human assets. It's not to dehumanize at all, because it's the value of that humanness that, when combined, enables us to be more than we ever could alone. And we are trying to create the grace and space for people to be who they are, to be the best that they are, and to contribute that best to what we are trying to deliver to our clients. That's simply what I meant by assets.
No one says that better. I know we're running up on time, and I had a zillion more questions. I think what I'd like to do is just kind of summarize the essence of what I'm hearing from you. You're saying don't change your strategy. Just make sure your strategy from the get-go covers the metrics aligned with the life cycle of the employee, always aligning your initiatives to ensure an equitable experience of all of the employees. I mean, these are some of the things that I hear you saying, aligned with the values of the organization, and make sure that there's clear alignment on everyone understanding the why we are doing it. That's resonated over and over and again in this conversation. But given this, given the SCOTUS decision, I do have one question for you that I think might be on the minds of some of us out there. How do you, and it doesn't sound like you need to do this often, so this is more of give us your thoughts or your opinion on this, but how do you position leaders in the DE&I function as advocates with a forward-looking perspective rather than auditors or defenders of current practices? There are leaders out there that are well-intentioned, but I think this whole SCOTUS thing has put well-intentioned leaders back on their heels. So how do you keep them engaged as advocates and forward-looking rather than auditors or defenders of current practices?
A couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, don't forget the benefits. So in its purest form, and our personal connection is the SCOTUS decision was about Title VI. Employment is around Title VII. Our CEO testified in support of Title VII in 1963. So when we look at Title VII, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, we kind of have a personal affinity for it. And the SCOTUS decision didn't rule on the merits of D&I. It ruled on the methodology through which colleges, from their perspective, were accomplishing more diverse student body populations. So in other words, it didn't say it wasn't valuable. And so a lot of the pullback, a lot of the uncertainty, a lot of what people are feeling is like, oh my goodness, it ruled against affirmative action. Yeah, it ruled against it as a methodology, but it didn't rule against diversity and the value of diversity. If you ever want some light night reading, go through and read the amicus briefs, because all kinds of organizations wrote briefs talking about the value of diversity. The US Army called it a matter of national security, to the point where not just the US Army, the armed forces, so 35 ex-military leaders of all branches of the US military wrote an amicus brief, and they called it a matter of national security. And they talked about high-performing diverse teams. You had people, IBM joined up with, I think it was Cirrus and Stanford and MIT to talk about the role of D&I in innovation, right? But bottom line is, don't forget the benefits. Relative to your teams, one of the things that we do is for their individual goals and objectives, they have to fit into and be put into the context of our overall D&I strategy. So in other words, you shouldn't be working on anything that's not advancing that overall global strategy. Because if your objectives have to fit into the global strategy, then it means you understand the global strategy. Because if you can't talk about the strategy, if you don't understand what the strategy is and the why of it and your role in it as someone on the team, then how do you expect other people to think of you as a strategist, or to think of you in a broader role than just a tactician who executes? We are not the party and the holiday celebration people. That's not what we do.
I'm going to leave you with those last words. Brilliantly stated. I can't thank you enough, Sheryl, for taking the time to impart your wisdom, your insights, and how you have just stayed the course on a very powerful strategy and execution of that strategy for so many years. With the remaining couple of minutes that we have left, Nina, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out. If we have an opportunity to take one last question from the chat, we will. If not, I'm sure we'll, follow up appropriately. So, Sheryl, again, thank you for who you are. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for joining our call. Nina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I cannot imagine a better closing than what Sheryl just offered us right now. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this call today. We've dropped your credits for your SHRM and HRCI credits in the chat so that you're able to get those credits. But thank you again to Sheryl, to Jackie, and to everyone on this call today.